And here, philosophically speaking, education is something that you imbibe every day. It is not necessarily what you learn in your undergraduate, your postgraduate, or your doctoral career. In fact, increasingly, more and more, we are having situations where it's the transferable skills that are becoming more important.
Welcome to the PhD talk show by Biopatrika. I am Priyanka Pandit, host for today's session. And today we have Dr. Anirban Sadhu. He's also known by his nickname Sudeep, and he's currently the Vice President of Global Regulatory Affairs at Teva Pharmaceuticals, Switzerland. So, welcome, Dr. Sudeep.
Thank you, Priyanka. Very happy to be here on your show. Let's get started.
So, firstly, how are you?
I'm as good as I can be. I'm always good. And when I'm not so good, I still try to make it worth the while. Like they say, when life throws lemons at you, just make lime juice.
Yeah. So, what I find interesting about you, Sudeep, is that you've had a 20-year-old career in regulatory, and now you are the Vice President of Global Regulatory Affairs at a global company like Teva. And I feel that somewhere education also plays an important role. So, can you walk us through your educational journey before transitioning to industry?
Right. So, yeah, I'll answer your question directly. But before I go to that, just like to make a quick point. I think, the corporate culture has moved on to the new paradigm that we have today is not necessarily putting as much emphasis on the number of years as used to be done before. Previously, there was this paradigm that if you have to rise up in your ranks, if you have to be somebody really senior, you had to have a couple of gray hair, right? And now that I think, increasingly that's not the case. On the contrary, for many of these senior positions, people like to have somebody young, certainly young in thought. And if you go by the number of years, I know many people who should have been ex-CEOs. Okay. Now, that said, education does play a role. And here, philosophically speaking, education is something that you imbibe every day. It is not necessarily what you learn in your undergraduate, your postgraduate, or your doctoral career. In fact, increasingly, more and more, we are having situations where it's the transferable skills that are becoming more important. You may have done a PhD in molecular biology, but you end up being a commercial leader, right? But still, there are certain things that you have learned in your doctoral degree and other things that you have picked up along the way that actually make you who you are today. But that would not be sufficient to make you where you want to go tomorrow. For that, you have to learn new things, right? So I can go on talking about these kind of things in a philosophical manner. And by that, I don't mean that they are less important, but let me answer your question more directly. So, my education, well, I mean, I have had a rather unconventional kind of an upbringing. I grew up in a monastery. That was, all of my early childhood going on into late school period. So till my high schooling, I would say. Then I studied in some of the more prominent Indian universities. The first one that comes to mind is Pune University, where I did my bachelor's in microbiology, which was kind of a new, interesting, and cutting-edge subject. This was already, I'm talking of end of last century, last millennium. Seems like a long time when I speak to people like you. And then I moved on to doing my research at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. Now, the TIFR for short, which was and still is one of the most prestigious institutes in India, and certainly comparable to among the better ones anywhere in the world. It was a very prestigious program. They used to take 4 or 5 people every year, sometimes not even that. And I was, you know, no harm in saying I was lucky. Luck always plays an important role, right? You have to be at the right time, in the right place at the right time. And I think, in everybody's career, when you look back, there comes a certain time, there is always this pivotal moment in your career where, in retrospect, in hindsight, you put your finger on that. So that is when everything changed. For me, that was TIFR. So from then onwards, I mean, it was a checkered period in my life. I finished whatever I was supposed to do in 3 years. I finished it kind of in 1.5 years. I, traveled far and wide, did, experiments and parts of my thesis in various parts of the world. Then decided to come over to Switzerland for my graduate program, for my PhD, which was in neuroscience. I was interested in the problem of understanding learning and memory. As I said, this was already end of the last century, and the problem of learning and memory in neuroscience was one of the biggest problems facing scientists today. It still is. They still haven't figured it out. I thought I would, but then, eventually, I did quite some interesting work in my PhD. But then by the time I'd finished my PhD, I had decided to kind of move on from academic research into the industry. And that was because my PhD program was also kind of a special program. I was technically an employee at Novartis headquarters in Basel, Switzerland, but I was also registered as a student in the University of Basel, and I was doing my research work at the Friedrich Miescher Institute. So I was getting paid like an employee. I was getting to do fun stuff like a student, and I was, affiliated to the university. It can't get better than that. So I'd been already in academic research for a long time by the time I finished my PhD, and then I decided to move to the industry, like I said. And since then, I haven't looked back. It's been 20 something years, right? And it continues to be an interesting journey. I learn things along the way, um, and every day.
So, Sudeep, what I've observed is that there is less awareness about regulatory affairs as a vocation. And so, can you share with our audience what is regulatory affairs and how a day in a life of a regulatory affairs professional looks like?
So, look, there used to be even less awareness about the regulatory profession when I entered it, right? At that time, generally people did not come into regulatory by choice, by design. They kind of ended up into regulatory either because they had started in quality, or they started in safety, drug safety, or they started in academic research and then moved on to industry research and then gradually, gravitated towards regulatory. Things have changed a lot. The profile of the profession and the profile of the professional both have changed. And these days I get, you know, 4 or 5 serious queries every month from highly qualified and highly motivated people who are interested in starting their career in regulatory by choice as a profession, right? So it's really become a very desirable, I would say, career path, and for good reasons, right? Because the pharmaceutical industry is the most highly regulated industry. It's more regulated than the aerospace industry. It's more regulated than the nuclear power industry or the nuclear bomb industry, if there's one that exists. In summary, there's no other industry that's more tightly regulated, and it is also at the same time an intensely science-driven industry, right? But at the same time, the you know there's it's a highly competitive industry. There's a lot of money in this industry, right? Big business, I mean, and therefore you need people who understand the science, who understand the business, who understand virtually everything, right? And therefore, it is easy to get regulatory professionals, but it's very, very difficult to get extremely good regulatory professionals, right? And that extremely good regulatory professional is somebody who understands the language of their stakeholders and is able to speak in that language as well. So you got to understand the regulations. You got to understand the legislative landscape. You got to understand the competitive landscape. You got to understand the scientific landscape, drug design, and you got to be able to be, good at project management, self-management. As you move higher up, comes people management in a direct or indirect scenario, right? So this is certainly the only function in the pharmaceutical industry that exists throughout the life cycle of a molecule. There is regulatory even before there is a molecule, and it continues all the way towards drug development, commercialization, approval, post-approval, all the way till there's a drug in the market. So it's a very interesting profession. To the second part of your question, what does it take to be successful? I think the more things you know, the better you are, and the higher up generally you tend to rise. So if you are just focused on, for example, the guidelines of a particular type of molecule, a particular type of a particular country or a region, then you specialize in that field, right? But if you have the ability to see the tree and see the forest, right, and you're good at project management, you're good at managing people, you are good at setting a vision and leading a team towards it, then gradually you get higher responsibilities and you manage a team. There could be all these questions could have very long answers. I could just go on and on, but I think for a discussion like this is enough.
That's great. So, what was it in regulatory affairs that fascinated you to move from PhD to regulatory?
Well, in my case, actually, like I said, even when I was finishing my PhD in my last year, I was kind of, I took some time deciding what is it that I want to do next. And most people who are uh, finishing their doctoral thesis don't actually do that advanced planning, right? And they kind of, tend to move to the next obvious thing, which is a postdoc. In my case, I could have chosen to do that, but instead I decided to take a step back and understand what else is possible. Because I was a part of Novartis, it was an additional benefit for me. I utilized that time talking to a cross section of people in the industry, within the company, and then coming to regulatory, as I said before, was a conscious choice before because I kind of realized that this is what I would love doing because it contains a good mix of everything. I loved the science. I had been successful in science and I still loved the science. So I didn't want to leave it altogether. But at the same time, in regulatory, I saw that there would be a good mix of many other things that, some of which I'd have to learn. And that's always an interesting challenge for me, right? So that's why I think in hindsight, I decided to go into regulatory. And after 20 years or so, I think, I made the right choice. No regrets.
That's great. And could you share with our viewers about your interview process when you were a beginner and you were moving from PhD to regulatory? I know it's long back, or when and
It's
also
long
when
back,
you were.
but I remember.
Hmm,
It's long back, but I remember because of a very strange reason. When I was going to go for my interview on that particular day, I remember the interview was at 3 o'clock. And, I started from home, assuming that it would take me another 15 minutes to reach the office for the interview. There was a circus party on the streets, and the tigers and the bear and the elephant, they were kind of, they had blocked the street. So I got late, a little bit late for the interview. And I would never forget that, right? Getting obstructed by a bear on the street on the way to your first interview in the life. Anyway, the first interview is always, something, the first of everything generally is very memorable, and so is the first interview. Look, what are you look and now after many years I've been on the other side of the table as well. I have interviewed people for the first time, and I know it's a momentous occasion for them as well, right? So, when you don't have any experience, you can't gauge somebody on their experience. So what you're looking for is potential. And increasingly, even for experienced people, I think the interview process has moved on from the paradigm of judging people based on their experience to judging people based on their potential. Because if you're only judging people based on their experience, then they are only good for the last job that they had done, not for the next job that they aspire to do, right? So I think a normal interviewer, and this is what I would do as well, would try to understand your potential. And potential takes different shapes, form, and flavors, right? It's about how you use your transferable skills. It's about how you behaved in certain situations. That's generally a good predictor, not a absolute predictor of how you would behave in similar situations in the future, right? It's about how you completed your task. It's about how you behaved under adverse circumstances. It's about your what kind of ambitions you showed in the past, right? It's about how you treat people. These kind of things become more important at senior levels in the organization. How you treat people, what is your personal integrity, how easily do you buckle, right? But I think from that point of view, the first interview is not fundamentally different from your 10th interview, right? Because there are certain deep-rooted traits that we are trying to look at. However, as I mentioned, the first interview certainly is a momentous occasion. You probably have not never been in an interview process like that. So for somebody coming from academia, I think what's important is to understand that in the industry, what's very important is teamwork. If you're doing your PhD, it's all about yourself. It's my thesis, it's my experiment, how well I'm able to do it, and how fast I'm able to do it. Here it's about shared responsibility. It's about shared credits, right? So we generally try to look at how good a person will be as a team player, right? But because these are also um, intensely science-focused jobs, we also do look at past performance and technical understanding of the subject, um, learning agility, right? Now, I may go on, and I can say a lot of stuff, but you have to go to your first interview to understand what a first interview is like,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
So I'll stop here.
So exactly, you're right. So you as we were talking about interview, let us also talk about skills. What are the skills? What skills are you looking for in a regulatory professional? And what are the skills that have transferred from your PhD days in your regulatory role?
What I look for in a regulatory professional depends on who I'm interviewing for what role. So what I'm trying to say is, uh, there are many things that differ depending on the seniority of the role and the type of the role, right? For very senior people, you know, I look at how they treat people. That's very, very important. You got to treat people respectfully. You got to be able to understand different cultures. You got to be able to, uh, treat people fairly. You got to be able to manage teams, very diverse, ethnically, geographically diverse teams across different continents. I manage a team of probably 300 plus people in about 60 countries,
Hmm.
right? So I got to be able to see the world from their point of view, right? And I got to be able to be comfortable with the idea that on certain occasions, in certain situations, they know more than me, right? But at other levels, and depending on the nature of the job, I'm sometimes looking for very deep domain expertise, understanding of a particular therapeutic area, um, understanding of a particular type of guidance, understanding of the regulatory landscape in a particular region, things like that, right? Um, but that said, there are certain commonalities, right? And the commonalities are number one, learning agility. Number two, transferable skills. Number three, ambition. Number four, um, ability to work in a team. I would say these are the four most important ones that have to be there in everybody in different levels, right? And lastly, I would say, interviewers sometimes are different from each other depending on how they assess a particular candidate. There are people who like to have a scoring sheet and they would, check you out on each and every parameter. Then there are others like myself who kind of, form a holistic opinion. But in the end, you have to be likable. I think that's the cherry on the cake, right? When we come out of an interview as an interviewer, the first question I ask myself, or if I have to give a feedback about the candidate to somebody, yes, I like him. Yes, I like her. Let's go ahead. In the end, whether you are, doing a mathematical assessment of that person or a checkbox assessment, it has to end up in whether I like that person or not. Make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And those were very critical points. And as you said, some things have to be experienced. Like your first interview also have to be experienced, right?
Exactly. Exactly. There, I would say, prepare well, but be yourself.
Yeah. So next is, what is the best way, according to you, to earn an internship or a job in this industry?
Look, persistence always pays off. And it pays off better if you are intelligent along with being persistent, right? So that's a good combination, intelligence and perception. It always helps if you are, a good planner. So don't think of it, don't stumble upon an internship as the next obvious step in your career. If you know that, as a part of your coursework, you have to do an internship or you want to do an internship, plan it months in advance, ideally a year in advance. Think about what is it that you want to get out of it. Think about what are the different types of offerings in the market. How do you go about it? The best way to learn about something is by talking to people. No amount of reading a book is enough, is I would say comparable to getting some intelligent input or intelligence input from a experienced person. So talk to people. That way you'll endear yourself to them as well. They'll see that you're serious about it. In the end, the person who's going to give you an internship also needs to get something out of it. So make it, mutually beneficial, make it a good deal for everybody, right? And there's no reason absolutely why it shouldn't happen.
That was a very good point. So, to know you a little better, how is your day? I mean, as a vice president, how is your day as a vice president of global regulatory affairs? And how is it different from that of a regulatory professional?
Well, I am a regulatory professional, so it's not different from that of a regulatory professional. But yes, the nature of your day changes depending on, I would say, the level at which you are working, right? It probably does not change too much depending on the company that you work for. In equivalent companies, in a multinational, environment setting, it's probably more or less the same. Um, Either I'm at, in my office or I'm somewhere in the world, right? And it's, I don't know, half the time I wake up on my bed at home, half the time I wake up in my bed in a hotel in a certain country wherever I happen to be on that day. And these are hectic days. So if I'm outside, if I'm traveling, which I do these days typically, 2 weeks out of four in a month. Previously, sometimes used to be even more before COVID. The day starts. My day certainly starts at 4:30 because I've been an early riser, courtesy my growing up in a monastic environment. But typically, otherwise, the day starts around 6. You are already, having breakfast and having your first breakfast meetings around 7:30. And then, it goes on and on, breakfast meetings to formal meetings to lunch meetings, to tea time discussions. And then it goes on to, after office socializing events where a lot of important decisions are taken and a lot of, bonding and connecting takes place. followed by dinner meetings and post-dinner meetings. And by the time you're back in your room, it's sometimes around 11 o'clock. And then it starts again at next morning at 4 o'clock. Right. So that's how it is when I'm traveling. When I'm not traveling, I like to maintain a certain regimen, a certain discipline in my life, which is very important, I think, for everybody, health-wise, for the benefit of the work you do. So I get up at 4:30. Between 4:30 and 5:30 or 6 is my private time. I maintain a certain amount of silence. I think, silence gives you silence gives you a lot more ideas and thoughts. By silence, I mean brain stilling. These days, we talk a lot about brainstorming. I believe brainstorming at best gives you mediocre ideas. The greatest of ideas comes when you are practicing brain stilling. So that's what I try to do in the morning. And then I'm generally at my desk by 8 o'clock on a good day. And now it's about 6 here, and I'm still with you.
That's a great routine, I mean, I must say. So, well, Sudeep, would you like to give some advice to students who are considering doing a PhD or who are considering to switch from PhD to a regulatory role?
Okay, that's a good point. Look, first of all, to those who are considering doing a PhD, I would say do it if you are the academic kinds, if you really love studying, if you are hell bent on solving a problem, if a certain problem in biology, it doesn't have to be a well-defined problem, but if it is, I want to understand life, I want to, if there's a problem that's really bothering you, whether it's in mathematics, whether it's in natural sciences, whether it's just a philosophical problem, then think about doing a PhD, right? If you are the academic kinds who loves to study even if they don't have to, then go ahead and do it. In today's world, I think we are having a vibrant economy everywhere else in the world as well. There are many other things you can do and be successful. So understand what is the mark of success for you. I was always the bookish kind. I was always the academic kind. I always loved to study and I still do, even though I don't have to. Or even if I do not have to do it, and if in the future I will still do it on my own. So I enjoyed every moment of my PhD, even though it became very, very stressful at times. But I know so many people who just realized it was not a right decision for them to do a PhD. So do it if you like to do it. Do it if you really want to do that. Secondly, during your PhD, if you have figured out, fine, for good reasons or bad, this is good. I mean, I've done it, I've learned it, I have a degree, and now I want to move into the academia, especially in corporate functions, then don't go for a postdoc. Every week I get queries and questions or meetings with folks who finished their PhD, then went on to do a postdoc, maybe one, maybe more than one, and now they're overqualified for every role that's coming across them, and they're finding it difficult to enter the industry. Right? It does not add value. Right? Certainly, don't get me wrong, a postdoc is a very useful and interesting and important experience if you want to move into an academic setting or into I would say, a research setting. Okay, if you want to move to a corporate setting, it's better to make that decision after your PhD.
Well, wonderful, Sudeep. It was great talking to you, and thank you for this very informational session that you had with me. Thank you.
I'm happy I enjoyed it. I hope you did as well. Thank you, Priyanka.